morning to all of you who are on the Pacific Coast, as I am, and good afternoon to those of you in the other parts of the country. This meeting is being recorded. I am Dr. Sangeeta Gupta. I want to talk to you a little bit about what our series is about and why we're doing it. Mariah and I worked together in founding and running the Diversity and Cross-Cultural Summit here in Southern California from 2007 to 2011. And we wanted to build a community that would support each other and learn from each other. With the events of the past year, we wanted to restart the conversation. So our goal is to provide information so that you can fully participate in these important conversations that we are all having today. Mariah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Welcome, everybody. My name is Mariah Hayden. As Sangeeta told you about our history together, I'm very excited for this series because we are focusing holistically and grassroots to issues of DEI. And so the reason for that is with the first conference we founded, it was very workplace focused, which is very necessary to talk about this in the workplace. But as we all know, especially when conversations in the last going on 2 years now, these issues of equity and race and inclusion and all of these things don't just impact us at work. They're at home, they're with our families, they're with our neighbors, they're with ourselves, with our own identity and how to learn and grow. And so this series is to take a different approach to that. Why I'm excited about today's conversation is there are a lot of shades, I don't even know if this is the right metaphor, but a lot of shades of gray, a lot of details in these conversations. It's not just, you know, everything fits in a bucket. There's a lot of buckets, there's a lot of sub buckets, there's a lot of connected buckets when we talk about these types of conversations. And so we're excited to dig deeper into this. So we feel like this really gives it context of what these issues are real like every day. So very excited about today's conversation. Real quick, just want to share with you a resource that is in the chat room, everybody. Can you Sangeeta, can you see the form?
Yes.
PDF. Okay, so everyone, this PDF is in the chat and we'll email it out afterwards as well. But if you scroll down here to the bottom, there are some terms to take away from culturally sensitive terms for the groups on the call today. And all of these down here link to articles that also get into further discussion. So I just want to point that out to you. Again, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mariah. So historically, and especially this past year, much of the conversations about racial issues in the US have been centered around Black and white interactions. But in order to really talk about race, we have to include all BIPOC groups. BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, people of color. So today we're going to look at race through the lens of Asian American, Asian Indian, myself, Indigenous individuals, and Latinx. We understand that no one speaks for their entire community, and we are not trying to speak for our entire community, but we can all learn from the various perspectives that that will be discussed today. Lastly, because we always want to leave you with practical tips and steps that you can utilize, you should have or will receive some information, as Mariah said, about each community that will be helping continuing this conversation that we all need to have. So we're very excited to have three wonderful speakers with us today, Marielle, Alvon, and Carmen. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge and your experiences with us. Can we start with Marielle and then Alvon and then Carmen? If you could please take a minute to introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, my name is Marielle Martinez. I always say it in Spanish too, Marielle Martinez, and my pronouns are she, ella. I'm here today mainly because I'm also really interested in these conversations. As a Puerto Rican who grew up in New York, New Jersey, and there are all these other pieces of identity too that converge and make me genuinely interested in wanting to understand myself and my experiences more and connect that to other folks' experiences, however different they may be from me. So that's really why I'm here, and I hope to be helpful in the conversation as well.
Hi, I guess it's my turn, right? My name is Alvon Bois Griffin. My family is out of Virginia. We are Powhatan. And also, as we grow, we learn more about ourselves as we get information, more and more information. I'm looking into this now, and why this is interesting to me. We have two people that have the name Maya. Well, we found out the Powhatan have a history with the Mayans coming up during the, well, I guess we'll say when the conquistadors were here. Anyway, maybe I'll get into that a little bit later on. But well, as I mentioned in my whole name, the reason I did that is because people always ask about your Indian name. In our situation, because, and this is brief, this is about me, so this is brief. It was our community with Native people were getting killed for speaking their languages, which meant that you couldn't really say your name. And so the names went into the languages that we learned. And my name, Griffin, is an eagle, and Griffin means eagle. Griffin is an eagle is a sky warrior, so it's a warrior eagle. Bois is French, which means comes from the woods. Powhatan are woodland Indians, coming out of the woods is what we're saying as far as Bois. Alvon was a mistake. It was Alvon is what it meant, and then they got Alvon out of it. Alvon comes from the Mayans. There's a pyramid in Oaxaca called Alvon. Anyway, Alvon is sunrise. So my name is Eagle Warrior, comes from the woods at sunrise, and that's the hidden version. And anyway, I'm in Tampa, and of course I'm with WMNF Radio. I've had been for a few years doing Two Worlds Indigenous Radio, but we'll get into more of that stuff. Trying to be brief.
Carmen?
Hi, everyone. My name is Carmen Yee. I am currently based in San Francisco, California, where I grew up. The noise in the background is my puppy trying to destroy everything that I own. You can tell. So
is your couch still alive?
Yes, it is. It is a secondhand couch, so at least there's that. So I was born in China, but I immigrated to the US at a very young age. I do identify as an immigrant because so much of my experience was shaped through the lens of my mom, who raised me as a single mother here in the Bay Area. I have lived a little bit of everywhere. Most recently, I moved back to the Bay Area from St. Louis in Missouri. Having lived in so many different places has really shaped my views on race and given me a better perspective on where Asian Americans and Chinese Americans are situated in that conversation. So I was so happy when Sangeeta reached out about this topic today.
Great, thank you. Since I'll be interjecting my own experiences as an Asian Indian American, Sangeeta means music, and it's pronounced Sangeeta in Hindi, but Sangeeta is the Americanized version of it. So let's talk about what's in a name. We've all heard the terms Latinx, Indigenous, Indian American, Asian Indian, as I just mentioned, East Asian, Asian Americans, and then the not to be used Oriental, Hispanic, Latin. These are all terms that we have heard. And why is it important that people use the right terminology when speaking about a community or a group of individuals? So I'll share an experience that I had. I was in the federal courthouse and I was getting into an elevator, and a federal judge came in into the elevator with me. And he looks over at me and he just started chatting with me. And my sister worked in that federal court. And so I was chatting back with him, and he said, you're very attractive. What are you? Meaning, what ethnicity? And I said, I'm Indian. And he said, oh, what tribe? And I said, no, not that kind of Indian. I'm Asian Indian. And he just looked at me for a minute, and then he said, oh, that's a really interesting combination. So he didn't understand Asian Indian as in Indian from Asia, Indian, but more as I'm Asian and I'm Indian. So I think it's really important that we talk about, what is in a name, and we get the right terminology, et cetera. So that's part of our conversation today as well. So what I'm going to be doing is facilitating a conversation with our three speakers and interjecting myself as well. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or share some of your experience. We want this to be a very interactive conversation. So my first question is to, I'm going to start out, is, what do you want everyone to understand about the history of your communities in the US? And Carmen, I'm going to start with you. And talk a little bit about the Asian American, Chinese American experience.
I majored in Asian American Studies in college, so this is really like when people are like, "What are you going to do with that after college?" Well, I'm going to speak on some panels with my major. That's what I'm going to do. But really, Asian American Studies and Ethnic Studies changed my whole life because it allowed me to better understand how my family came to this country and also the larger policies and events that have shaped my experience today. So Asian Americans have been used as a wedge by predominantly white institutions to alternately uphold the model minority, which I know Sangeeta will go into a little bit more later, or as a scapegoat when it suits white supremacy. And so Chinese Americans, as one of the oldest immigrant groups in this country, have had a long history of experiencing racism in the US, even though today that racism is not as overt, with the exception of COVID in this past year and a half. So just to give a couple of examples, a lot of people might not be familiar with the various race riots that involve predominantly Chinese communities. So in 1871, there was a Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, which today is a really thriving Asian American community. Like you can't go 2 blocks without running into like a Chinese restaurant or a boba shop. And then not too long after that, in 1880, there was a race riot in Denver. And so during this period, which was right after the height of the gold rush in California, when a lot of Chinese immigrants were brought in as cheap labor, Chinatowns were created as a form of self-sufficiency, which a lot of people might also not be as aware of. Today, we see Chinatowns as a huge tourist hub, bringing in revenue in terms of places to eat, places to shop at, but they were originally created not to attract tourists, but to keep outsiders out, because there was so much racism going on that Chinese folks felt like they had nowhere else to go and formed their own communities where they could supply their own food, create their own banks, have their own lending networks. And so as a previous tour guide of Chinatown in San Francisco, that's a piece of history that I always love sharing with people.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Yeah. Moving on.
Carmen.
Oh, yeah. Just a couple more examples, but moving on to World War II, there was the internment of Japanese Americans. And as a brief example of how Chinese Americans were used as a wedge to uphold white supremacy here, the backlash against Japanese Americans was so fierce and people feared so much for their lives that Chinese Americans said, hey, like, I'm not Japanese, don't like lump me in with those people. And folks actually came out with flyers on how to distinguish between what a Chinese person and what a Japanese person looked like. Like it was that intense. And then my final example, more recent, in 1982, Vincent Chin, who was murdered because he was drinking in a bar, and a couple of white auto workers who had been laid off thought he was Japanese, and they blamed Japan and the auto industry for them being laid off from their jobs, and so they beat him up, and eventually he died from his injuries. But this is, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but I wanted to start out with sharing these incidents because they are so crucial to how the Asian American community has developed and responded in the larger history of what we today know as like, oh, Asian Americans are doing so well, like their median income is higher than white people, their average education level is higher. But when you break it down and you go back in history, and very recent history, it tells a much different story.
Absolutely agree. And Asian American Studies was one of my 4 areas when I was working on my doctorate at UCLA. And it's really interesting that so much of the history is not taught. There was a school recently in Illinois that made the news because because Illinois is actually now going to start teaching Asian American history. That should not be so newsworthy that it hits all the news outlets, et cetera. It should be a normal part of learning about our common history that we all have. Muriel, do you want to talk a little bit about your community in the US?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the connection with Puerto Rico, sort of the formal relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, goes back to 1898, the end of the Spanish-American War. You've got the Treaty of Paris, and Spain cedes Puerto Rico as a territory to the United States. And then in 1917, you've got the Jones Act and all these other things happening. There was a lot of debate, basically, what do we do with Puerto Rico? And one of the decisions that was made that to this day really sort of distinguishes Puerto Rico from other Spanish-speaking countries is that all Puerto Ricans then became US citizens or had access to becoming US citizens. And that took different forms and shapes over the course of history. But to this day, Puerto Ricans are the only ones who have sort of automatic US citizenship. I should say the only ones from the 21 Spanish-speaking countries. So the question of immigration is really quite different in that Puerto Ricans don't have to apply for visas or go through any of these processes that can be so incredibly, traumatic and just challenging and difficult for other folks. So there's an area of privilege there for Puerto Ricans. The flip side of that is that we do not have a vote. So we are, I say, a colony. We are a property that the United States has exploited at will, and yet we don't have the right to decide who the president is. We don't get to have that vote. We have a member of Congress who basically is a sitting duck and doesn't really get to do anything. And so there's a lot of debate within the island as to, well, who do they want to be? And if you want to have a heated conversation, go to Puerto Rico and ask folks, walk into a restaurant and say, what do you think? Independence, stay as you are, or become a state. And boy, you're going to get folks riled up. So that is that. I'll leave it at that for now, but that is sort of the beginning of the connection between Puerto Rico and the US.
Okay, thank you. And Alvon?
Yes, in fact, first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to be here. This is wonderful. I've learned a lot of oh my gosh. Anyway, it's a different perspective when you're from here, quote unquote. In fact, if you would ask that question once again, how the first question you asked, I think of it differently because, once again, we're from here. This area, when you start talking United States, that's what they came here. We have to talk, when she was talking about Puerto, my mind goes to Taino, Boriquín. We think in terms of people who were here and who are still here and who are proud to be who they are and letting people know who they are. We're in the process of some of us, and as you mentioned earlier, we're not, I can't speak for everyone, but relearning, if we can, the languages that were basically stolen from us. Because as I mentioned earlier, people were getting killed for speaking their language. And so therefore there were languages that were lost. We're still trying to get that back. So when, once again, when you ask about here, I would say that people here need to learn where they are. Where I understand with thinking in terms of, we're the United States. I get that. But there were 500 nations. They're from Dene or Navajo, as you say, or Cherokee, Seminole, Ojibwe. There's so many different nations here and tribes that are still here. It's like people I would think would want to learn about where they are. And then we go from there. Then we go, if X amount of people came from England, X amount of people came from France, X amount of people came from wherever it might be. But understand where you are now and the foundation that the United States has been, was laid or built upon. And then we can have conversations. It's like, read this book, get back with me after you finish, we'll have a conversation then. Because you don't have to start if you start from the United States for us.
Yes, absolutely agree with you on that. It's so much history that was already here, so much culture that was already here, and yet we start the date of our country from the date that Europeans, et cetera, came over here, and we
Mhm.
don't focus on anything on thousands and thousands of years of history that had already taken place. Um, so we talked a little bit about, now that people have a little bit of history context for the different communities we're talking about, why is it important that people use the right terminology when they're talking about your communities? Marielle, do you want to start?
So now that's a really interesting question, right? When you talk about what is the right terminology. At the end of the day, at least in terms of the Latinx, Hispanic, et cetera, community, different people will have different preferences. And so I think even when I'm thinking broadly about diversity, equity, and inclusion, at the end of the day, for me, the goal is to get to know individual people, to create authentic connections with folks, because then you can have the conversation and you can say, Mariel, how would you like to be referred to? What are your pronouns? Do you use Latinx or Hispanic or Puerto Rican to refer to yourself? Because folks have different preferences and for very specific reasons. For example, there is a rejection of this notion that we are a monolith, right? If you come from a Spanish-speaking country, then there are these overarching things that are true about all of you. Of course, that's not true. But when we use one word to lump us all together, I think that can sometimes be a nod to fusing us and making us into this one thing, which we are not. And so I personally would use Latinx or Latina to refer to myself because I'm a cisgender woman. And I, given the opportunity, when I have the opportunity to speak to folks, I really want to honor what it is that they use to refer to themselves.
Right, so it's as simple as sometimes just asking. And I think people get tripped up on that and they make it more complicated than it actually is. It's like, how would you refer to yourself? How would you identify yourself? So it's part of that constant dialogue and constant conversation that we have to keep having with each other to, really try and understand the nuances, because that's really what it is. There's so much nuances in all of our histories that we need to understand that. And I really look at this as a lifelong journey. I have my doctorate in these areas. I've been out now for more than 20 years trying to work in this area and talk about these things, but yet I still consider that I'm on a journey of learning. And, we all will learn. I've learned things just, interacting with the three of our speakers today. So I think that's really important. Carmen, would you like to weigh in on why it is important that people use the right terminology from your perspective?
Yes, so continuing along the same veins of the Asian American community is not a monolith. There are so many different ethnicities and groups and languages spoken within Asian America. And that's not to talk about the fact that in the census, Asian American and Pacific Islander as a group are often lumped together when Asian American and Pacific Islander history and experiences with colonization are so very different. But right now I'm going to focus on Asian American. So what I was saying earlier about Chinese Americans and largely East Asians being touted as having achieved a certain level of success, that's not necessarily true across all the different ethnicities under Asian American. So for example, some communities that folks might not be as familiar with, so Bengali people from Bangladesh, Southeast Asian folks from Laos, Vietnam, Hmong people, I bet that for the majority of America, when Sunisa Lee recently won all around gold in the Olympics, it was the first time they had heard of like what a Hmong person even is. So Southeast Asians have historically been have had different socioeconomic mobility, different rates of college attainment. So it's important to be specific about what folks are talking about, because the histories of immigration and then mobility there are so very different.
Absolutely agree with you. And so many times people don't recognize that South Asians are a part of Asian Americans. As recently as a couple of weeks ago, someone said, well, you're not really Asian American. I said, yes, we are. India is in Asia. It's part of South Asia. And they're like, no, India's not in Asia. And I thought, well, where do you think India is? So there's still so much confusion about, even what constitutes an Asian American, what countries are part of the Asian American diaspora, et cetera, that people don't understand. And I think part of this goes back to, it's so important to learn about all of our histories, not just about a small segment of the histories. So, and we'll be talking about some of that later on. Alvon, did you want to add anything to this question about, using the right terminology when speaking about a community?
Sure. The most important thing is to whoever you're talking to, ask. Just ask. Just keep it really simple. Don't presume that you know. Sometimes we have a problem humbling ourselves, thinking that we have to know everything and we have to be in control of I'm going to tell you who you are, and then we're going to go from there. Ask, because people will share. Now, everybody knows. Not everybody knows in our particular situation, because once again, because of the various traumas and things that have happened, Native people, Indigenous people, if you will, in this country, not everybody knows. They know that they're not European, but they don't know who they are. They will tell you who they're told that they are, and then that's a different conversation. But if you ask and they know, then that's the foundation that you set that we can now build upon. Because okay, now we will use certain terms, I guess we'll say, and if don't be afraid to make a mistake. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. Is this okay? They'll tell you. They'll tell you what's comfortable for them, what's correct. And then you're right there, you're building a relationship which could last for a long time, but you will gain from it. Yeah. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say you're absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. It's most people, when you ask them questions like, what's the correct pronunciation of your name? They're not going to feel offended that you don't know how to pronounce their name. For me, at least, I feel that, wow, you're really trying to do it right. You're really taking enough care and concern for me as an individual that you want to try and pronounce my name correctly. So
usually,
for most people,
usually it's endearing. I went and bought eggs yesterday from a Latin restaurant, and she was writing on the box. And I can speak a little bit of Spanish because I grew up in Miami, but she wrote huevos, which I know is eggs, but then she put frito. And I go, does frito mean fried? And she goes, yeah. And I'm like, oh, and she smiled and lit up and was happy that I wanted to know and that I asked. But I think it's really important to point out that a lot of people don't ask because they would rather not look stupid and risk saying something stupid than humble themselves or make themselves vulnerable. And I think that takes a little bit of bravery to say, hey, I'm putting myself out there to look stupid. But I think if we empower everybody on this call to say, it's better to humble yourself and look stupid than to be a know-it-all and assume, you know what I mean? Like it's more respectful to make yourself vulnerable and ask versus not. But we need to acknowledge that it's scary, to look stupid.
Yeah, truly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the stereotypes that have been perpetuated about these different communities, and also how have these stereotypes impacted you? Marielle, did you want to start?
Okay, sure. One thing though I did want to say, because I would be remiss not to sort of qualify something I'd said earlier, which is, when asking folks things, there are degrees of trust that need to be built first. So, I mean, that may be an obvious statement, but I feel compelled to say it anyway, right? So if I ask someone, it's helpful to lead with sharing my information before I ask a person to share theirs. And when it comes to certain things that may feel intimate to a person, like for example, the question of pronouns, that is something that you would want to reserve for when you know that there is trust established between you and that person, because that's not necessarily something that everyone feels comfortable disclosing just off the bat. So I felt the need to say that, so I'm saying that. In terms of stereotypes, I can tell you, just my personal experience is peculiar, I'd say. I grew up, I mentioned earlier, in Newark, New Jersey, and the community that I was a part of was very much affirming. There were a lot of Puerto Ricans, there were a lot of Caribbean folks. It was a Black and brown community. And so I never felt othered. I really felt really proud of my culture and my background. And I felt like folks celebrated one another in that way. And so I didn't really start to feel it heavily until I left sort of the bubble of Newark and I went to college. And that's when I started to notice, the subtle, the microaggressions, that term that by now so many of us know, the little ways in which people sort of question. So I'll give you an example. I remember this one time I had just started college and I did, we got our grades back from a paper in English class and I did very well. And one of my fellow classmates asked, "Oh, how'd you do?" And so I shared and she was like, "Oh, and you wrote it yourself?" Now, I cannot say for sure where this question came from, but I can tell you how I experienced it, right? I thought, this person is questioning me as a Puerto Rican, as a woman, as a person from Newark, New Jersey. This person is questioning my ability, my capacity to write my own paper and to excel. Whether or not that's true, who knows? But these are the small ways in which we can feel that someone is thinking somehow less of us and of our ability to do certain things. I can tell you too, sort of fast forward to my life now, just a few years ago, I have two daughters, and there is colorism in our communities. We know this. I am a white passing person. My youngest daughter is not white passing, not by any stretch of the imagination. And therefore the experiences that she has and has already had are markedly different from my oldest child, who is sort of ethnically ambiguous. And so for folks who want to think that she's white, because that makes them feel more comfortable, they can do that. That will not happen with my youngest. And unfortunately, that means that my youngest has already experienced very targeted bigotry, ignorance, and racism. And so as a mother, I've had to navigate that in a very thoughtful way, because they are sisters and yet they're having very different experiences growing up. So I'll leave it at that for now.
It is hard. I mean, I remember being in third grade and I noticed that my teacher never called me by my first name. She always referred to me as Gupta. And so one day I asked her, I said, "Why do you call me Gupta by my last name where you're calling everyone else by their first name?" And so she said, "Well, what is your first name?" And I said, "It's Sangeeta." And she looked at me and she said, "Can I call you Sandy?" And I was a very quiet child, and being Asian American, you're brought up to be very respectful towards your elders and your teachers and everything. And so it was very surprising to me that I looked at her and I said, "No, that's not my name. It's Sangeeta." And so for the rest of the school year, she proceeded to call me absolutely nothing. So she could not take the time to, learn the 3 syllables of my name. And she just didn't call me anything for the rest of the school year. And, that was an experience that really stuck with me for many, many years. And so I don't allow people to, create a nickname for me, but I notice people still do that. And I've noticed that, as you said, Marielle, with the kids. So my son was doing a Scout merit badge and communication, public speaking. And the merit badge counselor could not get his name. His name is Rajan, so 2 syllables. Could not get his name. And I pronounced it for her. I even recorded it for her and sent it to her, texted it to her. His sister, who was in the same class as him for the merit badge, constantly corrected the teacher, constantly corrected. So this went on for 2 sessions. So I'm sitting at the kitchen table working, and they're sitting at the dining table taking this class on Zoom. And all of a sudden I hear, "Well, I'm just going to call you Rara." And I thought, did I just hear that? Did I really just hear that the instructor decide to give my son a nickname like Rara? What does that even mean? And so I'll tell you that from their perspective, I talked to the teacher, the merit badge counselor afterwards. She didn't see anything wrong in what she had done. And when I talked to my kids, and at this time they were 14, they said, we don't want to continue with this merit badge counselor. Both of them decided that, because my daughter said it's so disrespectful what she said to him, and my son felt the same way. And yet when I tried to talk to her, she could not understand why this was an issue for her to take my son's name and then just decide to create this nickname that she thought was funny and put it on him, and why that was not respectful. So our children are still seeing this. And I have the same situation where my son is a lighter shade of brown than my daughter is. And, she experienced her first experience of racism at 6, when a boy said, I won't play with you. And when she said, well, why won't you play with me? And he said, because you're brown. I don't want to play with brown people. And, it took a lot of questioning on her part. And, she kept asking me questions about color and, why are you a different color than daddy? My husband is also of Asian Indian descent, but he's a darker shade of brown. And so why are you different color? Why is my brother a slight different color brown than I am? And, you really have to sit there and try and explain that to them and do it with a sense of that they have a sense of their own identity, but where they also fit into society. So it can really get difficult, and it starts at a very young age. And I think so many people don't understand that these comments that they make can be very detrimental to a child's developing sense of identity. Carmen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, Acredito, you had your hand raised? Did you want to jump in?
Oh, yes, thank you. I wanted to share, like Sangeeta was saying, a personal story on that. So I come from Nepal, which is north of India, south of China. So my experience with colorism has begun since I was born. I am very much of a darker skin tone than any of my family is. And I've always been told Kali, which is referred to as the darker skin. It's named after the goddess Kali, who was just, in her sense, ferocious, but it's just used in a bad term in our society. So I've always heard that. So when I came to the United States, knowing what United States was for me was New York, where there are people of different color that are working together and living together. So I was really excited. But I came to a small town called Folsom, which is in California, which is in the county of Sacramento, which is the capital of California. And I came here being the third darkest kid of my class. So just growing up, the experience, like Sangeeta was saying, I can really vouch to that. And that was my experience here. In middle school, kind of still trying to fit into this world, I was once compared to a mud with my skin tone of being the darker tone and me not understanding the concept of it, where at the end, I just laughed it off. But, back then, that expression of mud made me feel really dirty of what that represents, being a mud. And I also remember one guy saying, we're talking about what we were going to do over the summer. And the guy had said, just imagine you in a swimsuit, meaning like we were talking about like sunburns and stuff. And he was just referring to my skin tone in that sense. So it's a really different story when you're an immigrant and you come from just having built like colorism with you since you were little, and then to come here to experience colorism and racism in the same sense, and you don't know how to really distinguish because you have always felt different. So I just wanted to share that story because I could relate to what Sangeeta's kids were experiencing, and because it's something that I have felt in a predominantly white town, and something that my sister has felt too, where she was sharing a story with me where she came here when she was in 3rd grade, and being, I think, like the second darkest kid in her room in that class, she remembered wanting to be white. And she said that she took an eraser thinking she could erase the color of her skin, and she started rubbing her skin. So it was we were expressing just our frustration, and she said it later in her life that she had done that. So just wanted to relate and share my story as well. Thank you.
Can you help me understand? I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
What is the difference between racism and colorism?
I think racism is well, for me, I'll just define my term, because obviously there's textbook and also your experience. I feel for colorism, it's really about being different because of the color of your skin. So like back home in Nepal, people that are of darker tone back then used to be would be assumed that you work in the field, where the lighter skin tone people were working in house, or they were richer so they could avoid the sun, right?
Right.
So
So
that
is it that racism has a tone of inequity and hate, and where colorism is a conversation about assumptions and differences based on the color of your skin? So it doesn't have quite the negative connotation as racism does. Is that the difference? Because both of them are lumping in assumptions based on skin tone, but what is the line of demarcation between the two?
So if
I think racism, sorry, I think racism doesn't always have to be because of the skin tone color either, though, because, you know, you can be racist towards a lighter skinned Asian person as well, right? Like for me, I don't think racism really takes into the consideration. It does take into consideration of the skin tone, because you're assuming that this person is, you know, people looking at me could assume that I am not from this country, so could tell me to go back home, or someone that was born here to tell them to go back home. So that could be considered, you know, racism. But with colorism, I think it's a built-in indifference that we feel of each other that was due to the white colonization. So for example, that I can say, and maybe Sangeeta can talk more about it, when from my history knowledge that I know, in India, when the British colony took over, they had the differences were made from, you know, the lighter skin tone Indians to the darker skin tone Indians, which still, even though that was experienced then and the British have left, that connotation of being a lighter skin to a dark skin still carries over, where people are still looked at differently because you are darker skin tone, because that connotation has since the colonization. So that's, I mean, I'm not an expert in that field, but just that would be mine. And I know Carmen was saying something, so I'll pass it over to her.
Yeah, I think that the topic of colorism and racism could be a whole another hour-long discussion. But to me, at the core, both are very much rooted in anti-Blackness, which is also what I wanted to talk about in terms of like stereotypes that affect Asian Americans and Chinese Americans. So if you think about it, like I say that it's rooted in anti-Blackness because in like the hierarchy.
So you're talking about colorism is rooted in anti-Blackness?
I think both are, both racism and colorism are, because when you think about the hierarchy of race, right, like white people are always put at the top and Black folks are always put at the bottom, and the folks who are in between fluctuate depending on moments in history, what's going on internationally, things like that. And then with colorism, it's also rooted in anti-Blackness because no matter what community or community of color that you're in, the closer you look to whiteness, the better people treat you. So for example, I lived in Hong Kong for a bit, where the majority of folks are Chinese. There are lots of different ethnicities in Hong Kong as well, but the vast majority of folks are Chinese who speak Cantonese. And so I experienced very little racism there as someone who fits in and can speak the local language, understands the culture, but I experienced a lot of colorism from my classmates because I am not as pale as some of them. So what Akriti was saying about how she's like, you know, you're on the darker end for your family, I very much am too, and they tell me that all the time. So in Hong Kong, I ran outside a lot. It's humid, it's hot, I'm gonna get darker. And one of my classmates passing by my room, I was wearing a tank top, and she said, "Oh, Carmen is so dark, but in a healthy way." And there's no real way to say tan in Cantonese. It translates to Black. So she was saying, "I look so Black, but in a healthy way." So there is an example of colorism, because even within being dark or Black, they had acceptable levels of what they found to be of a darker shade. So really, like, colorism is so rampant in like every community. I know that in college, one of my friends who's Mexican American, she's also white passing. She has green eyes. And she said, you know, like I'm the only one in my family who has colored eyes. And one of my friends who's Black, she said, brown is a color. So even though you can be a person of color and identify as part of a community of color, you can still be part of it, have that ingrained of like, oh, having like green, blue, you know, like non-brown eyes and fairer skin is better than having the alternative.
Absolutely. There's actually creams that are touted as if you use this cream, it will lighten your skin. And these are like $1 million industries in India, for example, that they're supposed to lighten your skin and therefore make you more attractive. And even when people are, you know, with under the arranged marriage system, they were like, they would always, you could always decode the ad. It would be like fair skin, you know, this type of thing. So even within the communities, there are, as both of them, Carmen was saying with that, there are different levels of acceptance, if you will, and different levels within the community based on how light you are or how dark you are and everything. So it's very much present within these different communities. And it comes back to what is the standard of beauty? What is the standard of what we find attractive? And it's white, it's eye shape. My daughter, who has a lot of East Asian friends, was talking to me about, well, you know, they get, a lot of her friends are talking about, you know, surgery for their eyes so that they can mimic a Western standard of beauty. And so we all are taught to gravitate towards a Western standard of beauty, a Western standard for skin color, et cetera. And that's what you're supposed to be striving towards. And I think it's very recent that we've been having these conversations about, well, there are other standards of beauty and everything like that. But it's amazing to me how ingrained these things become in your psyche, as how you really think of yourself and you think of other members of your community. Alvon, did you want to add anything to this conversation?
Well, yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, in Africa, also, I had heard that people are dying from bleaching their skin, whatever the chemicals that they used to become whiter. Some people died from that, but that's in going back to the names that you were talking about earlier. You know, when Europeans first came here, they couldn't pronounce a lot of, let's say, Native people's names. So they gave us numbers. They had, or a combination of letters and numbers, but they gave up trying to learn how to pronounce the name because it was just too hard or too, whatever reason. But yeah, so we were numbered. And there are people who I know whose and it doesn't go back that far, whose mothers, they remember their mother's number as opposed to their, well, obviously the mother's name, but they remember the number that was given to their mother. So it's not that long ago that this stuff happened. So that was one of the things that I wanted to bring up. Also, the baseball, football, basketball teams names that we just got rid of, and I guess I'm still working through that, the Washington football team's name. And I believe I mentioned I did the Two Worlds Indigenous radio show for like a little over 10 years. And we had the opportunity to have Amanda Blackhorse on the show, who was the person who led the call, I guess we'll say, against the Washington team. She was the one who wrote all the, I guess we'll say, documents against whatever, as far as Washington was concerned, Washington team was concerned. And so we delved into that, but yeah, the idea of some of the teams' names are not the idea. The actual name is derogatory, but they've been doing it for so long they don't know that. They may have gotten it from Hollywood, from the movies or whatever, and they say, oh, it's just became a part of the culture, but it was always derogatory. So, and once like younger people knew that, then you have that effect of like say turning on your TV on Sunday or going to a movie and hear and feeling that hurt and pain whenever the word is mentioned. Yeah, yes, it really is shocking. Sometimes when you know the difference, it shocks you and it goes right into your core that you can't yell, you can't scream, maybe because where you are, but it hurts and you can't get it out. And you walk with that. And that gets to that, wears on you. But anyway, just something brief.
Well, it's that whole concept of cultural appropriation and the right to take something from a culture. I was in England and I was in London, and I went to the British Museum, and I was standing there and I was looking at all of the things that were donated by the government of India, all these beautiful artifacts and just things that historically belong and are part of the history and culture of these other countries that were donated by the government of India, which at that time was England. And a gentleman came up to me and started chatting with me, and he said, "Isn't this great? We're preserving the history and culture of these communities." And I looked at him and I was trying to be very polite. And I said, but what makes it right? Why can't these communities protect their own history and cultures? Why is their history and culture sitting here thousands of miles from their country? Why are they not enjoying this? And he kept going on about how it's our duty to protect these cultures, and we're allowing them to continue and to thrive and everything like this. And he could not understand why this was offensive for me as an Asian Indian to be seeing all these things that belonged in my heritage, in my culture, in my country, in another country that's protecting all of these artifacts. And so cultural appropriation is something that happens to so many communities. And as Alvon was saying, in the names that we take and the way that we use these names, it's like, it's all right. We can take this from your culture and your country and your heritage, and we have the right to use it. Carmen, do you want to talk a little bit? And also, Marielle, I would love to hear if you have any thoughts about the cultural appropriation that happens with so many communities.
Yes, my friend this morning actually just sent me an article. I haven't read it yet. The title says Aquafina using a black scent is not code switching. So, oh my gosh, so much to unpack there. A lot of new terms for people, I bet. So Aquafina is a Chinese American actress, Chinese and Korean American, who was in Ocean's 8. She was in The Farewell, has been a really big name in the film industry lately. And she, and also Crazy Rich Asians is what she really, what skyrocketed her career. And in Crazy Rich Asians, she uses this accent this way of talking that people have described as a black accent, a black scent. So folks who are Black often use African-American vernacular, and people who are not Black sometimes appropriate Black speech with a fake Black scent. And so in the Asian American community, even though there are tons of examples of other cultures appropriating, like Chinese qipao, the dresses, or, like just have people who don't even know what Chinese characters are, getting them tattooed on themselves. There are also so many examples within the community of appropriating other cultures as well. And so I really wanted to bring it back to anti-Blackness, because that's what I feel like a lot of racism is rooted in. And so with Aquafina being accused of, well, not accused, she does use a Black scent. And then in other films later on that were more artistic, like The Farewell, her accent is gone. Like, that's just not the way she talks anymore. So that's one example I wanted to share of cultural appropriation.
Well, even if you look at the swastika, that's an Indian symbol. It's also a symbol in so many other cultures, and it was appropriated by the Nazis. And now, so many cultures are afraid of using that symbol because it's completely associated with Nazis. But it doesn't mean that in so many other cultures. But yet it's been appropriated and taken and misused, and now it's a part of Hindu religious ceremonies. And you actually put that on, like, for example, if you get a new home or a new car or something like that, you put that on there when you're praying that, you know, everyone be safe in this car, everyone have a happy life in this home or something. And I'm always a little bit concerned about using that now, because people are going to look at it and they're going to take a different meaning from it. So when you take symbols that are sacred in another country, or I see people just wearing the which is our symbol, you know, our religious symbol, just wearing the like randomly wearing it, and they're not Hindu, and they don't understand that you can't just take symbols from another culture and make them your own. And so I think that that's something that's very, very difficult for people to understand and want to, and say, okay, you know what, we've appropriated, like the Alvon was talking about the name of the Washington football team, we've appropriated this name, and how much effort had to go into getting that name back, taking the Redskins out of in a very negative way, taking it out of their name and saying, okay, we really don't have the right to use this name. We want to give it back because we appropriated this name. And I don't think people really understand how much it impacts a community when you appropriate their culture.
I have a question, the white girl in the room here with the question. A lot of times, like for instance, I'll wear the Hamsa hand. Am I saying it right? Or I am interested in Buddhism and other cultures and other religions. I describe myself as an omnist in that I think there's a little bit of truth in all of the religions. You know what I mean? And so is it bad if somebody, and feel free to be honest, I won't be offended, if I am interested in learning and wearing some of the symbology? Is that the problem? Or is the problem when I take it and say, hey, this is mine, I created it, I get to set the rules around it? Where's the line of demarcation?
Marielle, do you want to take this one?
Me with the hard questions over here.
No. I'm happy to do it, but I also want to give time to our speakers.
Yeah.
You know, as I was listening to you, Mariah, what my instinctive response is, the issue is with ignorance. So if I come up to you and I say, oh, what is this symbol? And you can give me a comprehensive answer. You understand what it means, you understand its origins, you are educated on the topic, you are not claiming that it is yours, then for me, that is decidedly different from if I come up to you and I say, what is this symbol? I say, I don't know, I just thought it was cute and I bought it.
Okay.
So that there needs to be a truth to why you are, using this symbol, and a depth to it, I think is how I would say.
It sounds like most importantly, a respect to it, that to understand what it is and why, not just, hey, everyone else is wearing one, so will I.
Yeah,
okay. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the intent, it's the respect that is given to it. I don't want to see on someone's butt when they're wearing workout clothes. I don't want to see that, because how would you feel if you had a picture of Jesus on somebody's butt? It would be disrespectful. So again, to what Marielle was saying, it's understanding what that represents, understanding and respecting what that represents, and using it in the correct manner. And also not taking something that you haven't earned. So, we take the issue of like tribal dances. There's the headdress that's worn. You earn that. It's not something that you just put on as a costume. It's earned. It's something that people work decades, and some people never achieve that, but it's something that they have worked very hard to get. It would be like someone just saying, hey, I kind of like the PhD, let me throw it in front of my name. We wouldn't do that. Or someone says, hey, let me put a medal on, let me say that, we don't expect someone to appropriate the medals of the military because they haven't earned them. We would really be shocked if someone, just say, oh, let me create a Purple Heart and I'm going to wear it, and because I think it looks cool. We wouldn't want that. We wouldn't accept that. But yet we accept, people wearing a headdress that is revered and is earned, and it's and we just say, yeah, let's put it on. Or taking, a religious symbol from another country and putting it on the bottom of your jeans. We would reject certain things, but yet at the same time, there's we don't know what this means, but let us go ahead and use it. So I think Marielle is absolutely right. If you can say what that symbol means to you and why, and with the history of it, and show respect towards it, I think that there's a better feeling about the fact that you're using it. Alvon, do you want to say something to this?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I was thinking, as you say it, saying that going back to the football team, I don't know if we want to call them dominant society or whatever, can take a symbol or even a word and decide that this, from now on, this word is what, or this is going to be what this word is something else. That didn't come out really clearly or whatever. But for example, the football team, in fact, there are many Native people that think that the term Redskins was the outside of their skin as far as the color of people and the earth and yada, yada, yada. But that was not necessarily the definition that I was taught, but that's the one that the team ran with. The real definition was when the United States government was paying money for scalps of Native people. The red skin came from the taking of Native people's scalps. And when you turned it over, that was that red skin. And so that's what was written down as, and that's why you don't use it as in representing a football team. It was not that. It was not the. It was the scalp inside of the scalp.
Was the bloody skull. That's
yes, that was the red skin. So that's why people who knew went, no, you cannot, no, don't use that term. We're going to fight with it. And it happened. We overturned that, but that's why they fought so hard. Not because of what we were told that it was meant, but it actually meant. So anyway, that I just wanted to throw that out there because they can take these symbols and what have you and say now it's going to mean this because we have that degree of power and whether it be control over media, whatever you want to call it, is going to mean this now. And so it's okay for you to put it on your jeans or it's okay for you to wear it on your shirt or whatever. You don't even have to know what it really means as long as you believe what we tell you it means. So I'm out on that one.
Right. Well, I mean, it's similar to someone coming into your home and taking an object from your home and saying, now it's mine. I can do whatever I want with it. You have no rights to it. If you put it in that's how I think about it, is that, if you came into my home and you admired something and I gave it to you of my own free will, and I said, you understand the significance of it or something like that, that's one thing. But you come into my home, you grab something and you say, now this is mine. Now I can put any meaning I want onto it. And that's where I think it's the taking of something that is sacred or has really significant meaning in another culture. Or as you were saying, Alvon, it means something completely different in another culture, and you're claiming it as your own. Sister, you have your hand up. You need to come off mute.
Yes, I'm very, very touched by this way of talking about appropriation of the cultures of others. I never really took it that way as disrespecting. Like I'll give you an example that I worked in Haiti and I was so happy to take the sculptures that were done by the Haitians and to promote the beauty of the sculpture. And so it's really astonishing to me that, that would be disrespectful. And enlighten me on that, please.
Marielle, do you want to take this one?
I'm not sure if I followed what you were saying.
Sister Lee, what did you do with the statue? Excuse me for interrupting.
I gave them as gifts. I gave them as gifts from Haiti.
So you sent them back to family in the United States and said, I bought this local art, this local sculpture in Haiti. Okay. Marielle, is that what we're talking about here? Appropriation?
No, that doesn't sound like appropriation to me, sister.
Okay.
I think it's sort of claiming it as your own, right? Or you know, inauthentically connecting to something. Yeah, I mean, briefly, I would say claiming it as your own, and it doesn't sound like that's what you were doing. Sounds like you were giving a gift. So as long as folks knew where it came from and who created these things, then I think, I mean, we can get into a deeper conversation around who benefits from these sales. Does the community sort of have ownership over the creation and the sale of the things that they have created? And that is perhaps an annexed conversation that we probably don't have time to get into now. But.
Okay, thank you.
I'm always fascinated by when we have these open dialogues about where the conversations go. I think it's
But I
really,
can, wait a minute,
it's really
I put it on at reaction fight with your hand.
Who was that?
I think Sister was trying to mute herself. So I think what thoughts we want to leave all of you with about cultural appropriation, it's not that we don't want to share our cultures and have you appreciate our cultures. I think it's the taking of without respect, without understanding. Like, I don't have a problem with someone wearing an Om pendant. What I have a problem with is when they don't understand it, what it means. It's trendy. It's not worn with any understanding of what it truly means, and just not even knowing what it means. I think it's that knowledge. So Alvon, when you were talking about, you know, the Redskins and what it truly means, that's so hard to think about someone just taking that and saying, we're going to give it a different meaning. We're not going to respect its original meaning. And I think that's where you have to, what I really think if you take away with it is, what is your intent in using this? I think if you want to take like just a high level, what is your intent in using this word or using this artifact or using this symbol of another culture? What is that intent behind it?
And sister, you, first of all, thank you for being vulnerable and asking the question. Like that's the bravery that, you know, a lot of us need to take on or to be okay with. You put yourself out there and say, oh my gosh, did I screw up? You know, and in fact, you were supporting the local arts. You were sharing that culture with some of the United States. So that's a good thing. But I think a lot of times we hear, oh, you know, they're changing another football name. And I wouldn't say people on this call, because you wouldn't be on this call if you were like this. But a lot of people in American culture roll their eyes, oh, this PC stuff is, you know, getting out of hand. But I think if everybody everywhere could just do two simple things, slow down and not judge, but say that's different, not wrong. But difference is okay. Being ethnocentric means you think my way is the right way. Difference is okay. But even simpler than that, stopping and asking, why are people upset? Like from an honest place, not a sarcastic, jaded place. But if we just learn to ask why, there's a good reason behind it. People aren't just trying to be agitated and argue with another football team. I mean, I was crying when you said that. Alvon, I'm tearing up over here thinking of these scalps and just like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, what a horrific history. No, you wouldn't want to name a team over that. But the why, people don't want to slow down and ask the why. We want to assume we're just such a culture of know-it-alls. Again, not us, but like the greater thing. And I think slowing down and asking why is so valuable.
And also listening.
Yeah, listening, ask why, shut up and listen.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to jump towards the end of our questions that we had thought to discuss, just because I'm looking at the time and realizing this has been such a wonderful and rich conversation that I feel like we could go for another hour, but I know that we're limited on our time. So I want to ask we always want people to leave our sessions with some actionable steps, because we believe in being practical and giving you the tools to go forward and talk about these things. So I want to ask each of our speakers, what are a couple of the things that the people who are attending, who are here today, what are some of the things that they can do differently moving forward? Carmen, do you want to start?
Yes. With everything that's been going on with the anti-Asian racism during COVID, I really wanted to focus on this because it's the most tangible example of racism against Asian Americans right now. So I'm sharing a link in the chat to bystander intervention training. There's a couple of different levels here. There's one for more general conflict de-escalation, which I imagine can be helpful in the home as well as outside the home. And then there are more specific ones on what to do as a bystander to combat anti-Asian racism and harassment. So in this time when literally people's lives are at stake and people are really getting seriously hurt over what the media has perpetuated about how COVID started, this I think is a really tangible thing to share with everyone about next steps that you can take.
That's absolutely great. And you know, the term, the bystander, and I do a lot of pro bono work for Boy Scouts of America, bystander and upstander. And I'm working with our youth right now because they're the youth leadership, is saying, what is your responsibility? You know, where's your threshold for when you will step in and correct, like a younger scout, for example, who has said something. So we're talking to them about the difference between being a bystander and being an upstander. So thank you for that link, Carmen. That's great. Mariam?
There are so many ways that I could go with this. The one thing that I want to return to is this concept of humility. I think, you know, there is a danger when we do the work, or when we have educated ourselves to a point in thinking that we therefore are exempt from being ignorant, and we're not, right? And so I think first and foremost to remember that everyone is at some place of learning, and there's always more learning to be done. I think that can be really helpful, both in checking ourselves and staying open, right, to our own ignorance, and also in being perhaps a little bit more open and more understanding to folks who are earlier in the journey to learning and to growth. So that's the first thing that I would say. Beyond that, though, when you feel that you are ready to engage, understanding that there are different ways to do that. So Carmen shared a link in terms of, you know, certain actionable steps, how you intervene. Acknowledging that maybe some folks, for different reasons, don't want to engage in that way. That doesn't mean that you can't be part of the work and that you can't be part of the solution. So really consider the different ways in which you can add to the conversation, the different ways in which you, being authentic to who you are and what you sort of where you are and your experiences are, can still be helpful. And so I guess I'll leave it at that.
I think that's a great comment, because we are all on a journey. And, you know, I have learned today from all of you new things. And I think as long as we keep that intent of wanting to continue to learn on our journey, and you know, keep that in the back of our minds as we're dealing with people and interacting with people, and just have that humility. I really like the way that you said that. Alvon?
Yes, I'm sitting here thinking there's so many opportunities. First of all, we need to find out where they can have more conversations like this, because I've learned a lot today myself. And I thank everyone for contributing to my growth. But to wherever it is that you're listening from, there should be a way to find events like powwows that are close to you. Now, that's not the end. That's the beginning, getting into an environment where, like, say, at an event like that, they will educate you a little bit on things. That's just getting your toe in the door. That's someplace that you can go. I could say books, you know, research native authors, and not necessarily just fiction, but find out historical views from native perspectives. But there's just so much, and it's right there. It's outside your door, because, well, there again, I don't know where you're listening from or watching from, but if you're any place that's called has a last word, America, it's outside your door. You're here. this is what happens here. This is what happened here before Europeans came. Is still here. So you have access to it. You just have to open your eyes to it. I'm trying to give specifics, but I can't think of anything more because the powwows and events like that are happening all over the continent. You know, it's not every day, but they're out there. So just research that and go and humble yourself, because you're going to hear things that might make you uncomfortable, but you're going to learn from them. So thank you for the time. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for what you're about to do after this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, Alvon, we obviously before COVID, we used to take our kids to a ton of different national parks. And when we go to the national parks, we always went to the visitor center and we looked at what books they had there, because that's a very practical thing that you can do. And we pick up books written by local authors everywhere we go. We went to Kauai and we were there in the different stores, and actually even in a Costco there, they had so many children's books written by local authors and about local mythology and history and everything. So we always buy those books, and we always, you know, have our children read about different cultures and everything, because even within our own country, I mean, Kauai is part of Hawaii, which is part of the US, but even there we found such beauty in the stories and everything like that. So it's that, it's, you know, also, you know, what Marielle said, it's that journey. It's that constant journey of learning. So the next time you go somewhere, learn about the local history. About of what you are actually where you actually are. UCLA, one of the links in that document that Mariah's going to send you, UCLA has this whole series of articles and everything about the history of the land where UCLA currently is, and who lived there and what their, you know, customs were and all of that. Read some of that, you know, expand beyond the authors that you normally read. And again, read fiction and nonfiction. I think that was a great suggestion. So does anyone have anything last minute? We have a few minutes left. Does anyone have anything that they would like to? Sister, you have your hand up? Make sure you unmute. Sister, you need to unmute yourself.
Trying to. Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to react to one of the things that Sister said about, at any rate, what I experienced when I went to Peru was the opposite of what she stated. One day somebody came to me at work and said, my mother's leaving, so I'd be glad for you to meet her. And I said, okay, you're welcome. So she came at the house with the mother, and she said to her, well, you know, the fact that she's leaving here, we'd like you to give her a blouse. I said, what in Sam Hill is this all about? I just couldn't figure it out. And it was exactly that. The custom is to give somebody something, but it's the something that they want that you don't care to give. And that's exactly what my experience was. Okay. And so we'll be back to pick it up. And so they came back and they picked up the blouse that I had on, and that's what they wanted to go back with, but I never saw it after. Now, the fact for Sister, it would be just the opposite of what she said. But all the time that we were talking, I was living an experience there, because we as sisters come from all different parts. And those that come from the mountains in Peru are surely very different than those that live in Lima. And yet you're living in the same house. How interesting to have to hear them with your heart and nowhere else because of the differences. Oh yes, but you have this. Oh yes, but we don't have that where we are. Oh yes, it's like this and it's like that. So we learned about their cultures, but both of them in the same house. Can you just picture that? And it was a wonderful experience. But I think the best one for me was the day that I went in the pulpit to make one of the readings, when all of a sudden, as I finished doing the readings in Spanish, all of a sudden when I came down, they said, she's just like one of us now. because my Spanish was exactly like theirs. Isn't that interesting? How people react to you or to, and you forever say, do I fit here or don't I fit here or whatever. But anyway, those are the blessings of knowing about other cultures too.
Mhm.
I just love what you said. Listen with your heart. That I
Yes.
think says it all for me, at least, is that if we listen to each other with our hearts and not preconceived notions, I think we can learn so much,
Mhm.
absolutely so much. I would really like to thank our speakers for being here today. This was a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed hearing
Yes.
from all of you, and then
All
also
three of
our
them.
participants. Just thank you so much. Given the hardships that so many are facing in our country, normally we give speaker gifts, but what Mariah and I decided to do with our speaker series is to make a donation to a local food bank to thank our speakers for taking the time to be here today and to share their knowledge and their experiences with us. I think we've all been able to listen with our heart and learn something. The recording will be available shortly, and you'll get an email with the link to the recording. And we would like to invite you to join us on Tuesday, September 21st for our next session, when we're going to be talking
Good.
about critical race theory and privilege, two very hot button topics that are taking place in our country today. Mariah, do you have any last words that you want to say?
Oh, I have so much to say. Today's been like one of the more moving ones. Like, I don't know, I'm very emotional about a lot of the conversations. I just feel lucky. I feel lucky and privileged to hear this from you guys. I'm literally like crying. I don't know why I'm so emotional.
I am too.
One of the things about the reason why, and I'll wrap it up. I know I have a couple more minutes, but I'm as German as it gets. I grew up in the whitest of biker families and German families, and this type of stuff was not taught to me. In fact, the opposite was taught around me. But I have family in Hawaii, my dad's sisters in Hawaii, and I'm just thinking of them, especially as you speak about Kauai, and how lucky I got. I got to go to Kauai when I was 11, and that's where I started to learn about this. My family, they were white as well, but they'd lived there forever, and they're like, Mariah, this is the local culture, and this is the black sand, and this is the locals, and this is what a hula dance really means. And I was taught all of that at 11 years old, and how not to be a haole and how to respect the culture. And that lesson really stuck with me. And here I am, all these years later, and there's so many people who look like me and come from the background as I do, and they're completely tone deaf to any of these conversations. Not just tone deaf, but angry. And this gets into next month's conversation. And so I just really, it's funny, I'm speaking about privilege as a Caucasian, but I'm saying I'm privileged to be on this side of the conversation, to hear this, to learn from it. And I don't know how I got so lucky, because a lot of people don't know what they don't know,
You don't
And
know what they're missing.
yeah, it makes me sad that, somebody scalped Indians and everything else, and there are people who look like me, and I'm just upset. But I feel lucky to be part of the conversation. You guys, I've never cried like this before.
Yeah.
In this series. It's just, I'm feeling so much. But in the spirit of what I'm talking about, I think being vulnerable and asking questions and looking silly as I might right now, crying, is a way forward for a lot of us, to put ourselves out there and to feel shame and to feel hope and to all of this. So thank you for coming on this journey with Sangeeta and I. If you go, there's our website, kind of to get back to housekeeping here. I'll email it out, but there's usually a link to the next talk. But if you go to the homepage, it shows all the talks for the whole year that have all been recorded, and all the talks that are to come for the rest of the year. We don't have all of our speakers picked out for the rest of the year. So if you look at a topic, you're like, hey, I know somebody that would be really good. We want suggestions. We also want to hear about topics. Like if you guys are thinking of something a week from now, like it'd be really good if they had a conversation about blah. let us know, because most likely this programming is going to go into 2022. And it's very organic for Sangita and I. As stuff comes up, that's the next topic, and we find the speaker. And if we can't find a speaker, then we just talk about it amongst ourselves. But please stay with us, come back. We want your suggestions, and thank you for your I'm so emotional. Thank you for your generosity and sharing today. It's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, critical race theory, that came out of a session we did on race and gender in the classroom. And so we were starting to talk about, you know, what's going on in our country today with people objecting to critical race theory, et cetera. And so that's why we're talking about that next month. This was not on our original agenda when we laid out the year back in January. So we want the conversations to be about things that interest you, that would help you grow, and everything. So please, we are very open to suggestions. In November, we're doing kind of a fun talk about how to keep your foot out of your mouth during the holidays. And because having these very difficult conversations during the holidays when our families get together, even if it's together by Zoom, we want to, you know, talk about that and talk about our experiences and how we can overcome some of these roadblocks. But thank you again to our speakers, and thank you again to everyone who's attending. We really, this is from our heart that Mariah and I do this, and we really appreciate you in this journey with us. So we will see you next month. Enjoy the rest of your
Yes,
day.
yes.
Thank
you very much.
Sure, absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 Everybody was great.